Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Australia. And for a while now, Australian troops' actions in places like Afghanistan especially have been under the spotlight. We've just had that ABC journalist who, as now the government has decided they will not be going after that journalist at this point in time, even though there was 3 years of an investigation into that journalist, again speaking about possible war crimes or alleged war crimes or crimes overall, I should say, by Australian troops in places like Afghanistan. Now, video footage has come out of an Australian patrol in Afghanistan. This is all back from 2012, but the videos have just come out. And in that footage, members of an Australian patrol in the country are talking about an apparent execution of a quote-unquote totally compliant prisoner by one of their comrades. The Inspector General of the Australian Defence Forces is currently looking into that and investigating that issue. On top of that, there's also then a report that's come out about Australian forces reportedly shooting and killing an Afghan prisoner because there wasn't enough space on their aircraft, and this happened during a drug operation at Camp Bastion. Again, both of these events occurred back in 2012. Certainly, these are allegations at this point in time and would all need to be proven through a proper investigation. Nevertheless, will the country be able to, A, properly investigate this? Because in countries like Britain, for example, we've seen, hesitance to hold soldiers to account. And certainly for any country, it is tough to do so when militaries go into countries around the world, under, of course, the guise of the quote-unquote war on terror at that point in time. Let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Damien Kinsbury, who is Professor of International Politics. He's joining us today from Melbourne. Also joining us from Melbourne is Dr. Greg Barton, who is a professor of global Islamic politics. Greg and Damien, good evening to you both, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. Damien, let me start with you. What do you make of the video? I mean, it's quite disturbing, and we will be playing parts of it during the show as well. But nevertheless, I wanted to get your take on it. I mean, it seems like a fairly open and shut case.
On the face here, it does appear that an offence has been committed. There is an investigation at the moment, and the details look like coming out. But the Australian Defence Force has recognised that there is a profound problem in the culture of the Special Air Service, the SAS, Australia's elite military force. And it has been undergoing a thorough review of that organisation with a view to changing its what it calls its overly warlike military culture.
Greg, what are your thoughts about that? I mean, obviously the issue always is in these cases that will there be scapegoating done, or will there be a proper investigation into these sorts of actions?
Well, I agree with David's comments. So far, it does look like we're going to get to the bottom of this. This whole process goes back to 2016 when Major Jeff Sengelman, who was in charge of who had oversight over Special Air Services and the commandos, found out it was a toxic culture, was very concerned, and launched an investigation behind the scenes. And then because of that investigation, it started this internal military inquiry. It has to go a lot further yet. And the reference to the ABC journalist story is very significant because it should never be the case that journalists are being pursued because of information given to them that's legitimate in the public interest. Having said that, it looks like things are on the right track. There's a toxic culture that needs to be gotten to the bottom of at the very least, and very likely war crimes that need to be resolved.
On the point of the ABC journalist and that entire investigation, Damien, I wonder where your thoughts are on that.
Look, there's certainly been a problem in Australia, elsewhere as well, I think, but in Australia in terms of trying to muzzle journalists, not because what they're saying is wrong, but because what they're saying is ultimately correct. And that has been problematic. Having said that, we have seen a number of instances recently where courts have found in favour of the journalists and or cases against them haven't been pursued. So this is... This matter has become public now. It is on the public agenda. I think there is a widespread recognition that there is a problem with the culture of the SAS, and as I said, that is in the process of being reformed. We need to keep in mind, though, a couple of matters, that the SAS has been on very high rotation in Afghanistan up until quite recently, and the pressure of that high rotation, I think, may have contributed to some of the lapses in discipline. Added to that, I think, too, that there's much greater scrutiny of the behaviour of soldiers in the field now than there has been in the past. I know that in the past there certainly have been actions perpetrated by soldiers of the Australian military, of this ADF, but also others that simply were regarded as what happens in a time of war. And we are living under much stricter guidelines for soldiers' behaviour, appropriate guidelines, no doubt, but they are much stricter, and I think that soldiers are perhaps a little slower sometimes in coming to understand these requirements, particularly when they are responding to what might be seen to be pressures of being in the field for extended periods.
Does one balance that sort of thing out, Greg, do you think, in your opinion? Because as Damien there pointed out, certainly there are a lot of pressures upon these soldiers, right? But it's also then down to international law. You know, I mean, there's a lot that comes into play here, right? Just because you're overseas and in a country like Afghanistan, where sure, of course, the territory is tough and you've been sent there for a tough assignment. How does one balance that out then with ensuring that human rights are followed, that there are no abuses, etc.?
Waqar, it is difficult and complex, but there are a few things that are very clear. Firstly, war crimes must be investigated and must be prosecuted. There must be transparency. It undermines everything unless that happens, including the service of those who have served with the SAS and other aspects of the military and police in places like Afghanistan. It's certainly owed to the people of Afghanistan. Secondly, there are many people who have served who have come back very damaged physically and emotionally, psychologically. It doesn't help them to have this sense of guilt and not being able to speak up hanging over their heads. It's important for their sake, for the veterans, that these things are investigated. Of course, we're looking at the future of Afghanistan. This whole military campaign of the last 19 years never had a clear objective. It's now in this very difficult stage of negotiations with the Taliban towards trying to work out some pathway to peace. It's really important to address issues of justice and uncover them. And then lastly, within the SAS, it's had its own separate chain of command, and there's some speculation or pretty clear evidence that has not helped give transparency and accountability. And so the question is now, how can this be fixed so the injustice of the past is faced up to and dealt with, but also so that these problems are not repeated in the future? What structural problems need to be fixed? And that's one of the key issues at the moment.
Yeah, so, you know, when it comes to that ABC journalist issue, Damien, there was a lot of talk about the fact that, you know, there aren't proper safeguards in place, pardon me, in Australia for journalists in such cases, and that's why the government was able to go ahead with that sort of bullying, as it was called, I think, on the part of many in the journalist community. Do you think that laws need to be brought into place where these sorts of revelations are protected, in the sense that, you know, authorities can't go after those who are actually revealing these sorts of atrocities or alleged atrocities?
Yes, absolutely. There's a big debate going on in Australia and elsewhere at the moment over whistleblower protections, and journalists in Australia are certainly calling for those whistleblower protections to be brought into play. They don't currently exist in any meaningful sense. So that really, I think, is a critical issue, particularly at a time when governments are more sensitive to information that they can't manage or control. And again, this is not just an issue in Australia. The United States, the UK, and elsewhere, we see this issue arising. And this really is a contest, if you like, between the type of society we hope to live in, whether it's going to be an open society, as it has been to a large extent in the past, or whether it's going to become a more closed society. And I think in a number of respects, the issue of freedom of information and its relationship to democracy and the value of democracy is perhaps at something of a crossroads. So we would like to think that it's going to be protected and enhanced, but at this stage I wouldn't see that there are any guarantees that whistleblowers, as in this case, are going to be protected into the future.
And if we can, for a moment, Greg, also talk about the laws in the country, right? So in many places, of course, soldiers are protected, and a lot of those sorts of laws make sense, right? Because you don't want soldiers going into any war situation where they're completely stressed from the get-go, even before hitting the ground, right? Nevertheless, we need to ensure that human rights are followed. So this sort of alludes to my earlier question to you as well. Do you think that Australia right now has the laws in place to be able to hold to account those it needs to? Because one of the things that's of concern, I would imagine, is that these events occurred back in 2012. There are obviously, then I imagine, questions of statutes of limitations as well.
The points, Waqar, that Damien were making are very important points. We often think of the importance of the media and civil society with new and emerging democracies, but with old and mature democracies, UK, US, Australia, Europe, we have problems. In Australia, in some ways, we're in a worse situation. We don't have a Bill of Rights. We don't have sufficient protections for whistleblowers. The issue with the ABC, and there was some substance of this issue, was that if classified documents are handed on unpublished, that is inherently problematic. But this was in the public interest. It was right that the ABC did what they did, and the prosecution or the persecution, the bullying, the intimidation was just completely inappropriate and undermines the transparency that's necessary. Australia needs to do some reforms in this space, and that may seem surprising for a mature democracy, but that's the reality. We all are struggling with this.
All right, Damien, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. Are you confident in the investigation and in the judicial authorities doing the right thing?
Yes, broadly speaking, I am. I think that the judicial process is still fairly robust, that it is fairly transparent, and that one would expect, I think with a reasonable degree of confidence, that it's going to produce a fairly honest result. The absolutes can't be guaranteed, I suppose, but going on past history, and the Australian judicial process is one that is one element of our society that I think still can hold its head up fairly high and can say with a fair degree of certainty that it hasn't been tainted by the sorts of compromises that might have afflicted other parts of our society and indeed other Western societies over the last several years. So the real question is what the mitigating circumstances might be or might be argued to be, the degrees of culpability and so on. But that's exactly the same as it would be in any criminal trial, and one would expect it to be treated in very much that manner.
Yeah. Very good, and we really appreciate both of your times this evening. That was Damien and Greg, both of them speaking to us from Melbourne this evening, sharing their expertise about this case of not only the video. I mean, this has been a long-standing issue in Australia, at least for a while now, ever since ABC released that investigation. I think it was about 3 years ago, was it? About possible war crimes and crimes committed by Australian forces in Afghanistan. The establishment, as we know, went quite strongly after that specific journalist who released that information through a whistleblower. And now, thankfully, that case has been dropped after much pressure from the public and from the journalist community. But now we also have this video that's come out about soldiers themselves talking about one of their comrades having killed a compliant prisoner. And then on top of that, thirdly, a report about Australian forces possibly killing a prisoner in Afghanistan simply because they didn't have enough space to have him on their aircraft. And this was during a drug operation at Camp Bastion. All of these events occurring in 2012. Will Australia live up to its ideals, as it so claims, and do the right thing and hold those who are guilty accountable in these cases? Of course, that's a question that we'll have to wait and see if that really pans out. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss the State Department possibly deciding, the U.S. State Department, that is, to declare certain international NGOs, and those include the likes of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Oxfam, as anti-Semitic, and that governments around the world should not support their work. All of this, of course, happening because one would imagine that these organizations do also criticize the Israeli occupation as well as Israeli authorities' actions towards Palestinians in the occupied territories. Now, if that declaration were to in fact happen, it has not yet happened. These are all just reports that have come out. What does that then mean? Because there isn't the broader issue, right, about, for example, IHRA definition of what anti-Semitism is. Can we say that criticism of Israel equates or is equal to anti-Semitism at this point in time? Is that a fair assumption to make? Because if Israel, as it declares itself is the only democracy in the Middle East, is a free society, why can't it then be open to legitimate criticism of its actions, both towards Palestinians and other of its policies as well? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Aaron Lakoff, who is the communications and media lead at Independent Jewish Voices Canada. He's joining us this morning from Montreal. Aaron, thanks very much for your time this morning and for joining us here in Scope. On this issue of, the equal signs that have been placed between criticizing Israel and anti-Semitism, what are your thoughts on that?
Deeply chilling. For myself, as someone who is Jewish and works for a national Jewish organization here in Canada, we are absolutely opposed to the IHRA, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and their definition of anti-Semitism. I would say that this definition of anti-Semitism is actually dangerous for Jews and for Palestinians and Muslim and Arab people more broadly. It's dangerous for Jews because it conflates actual anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel, which is a state like any other state that should be criticized openly and freely, without having that label simply put on you for being anti-Semitic. And then, of course, it's dangerous to Palestinians because it risks delegitimizing their very legitimate fight for human rights.
What I wonder is, whenever these sorts of issues come up, Aaron, there isn't much uproar. I mean, yes, in this case, I would imagine, of course, the human rights groups themselves have certainly spoken out against being targeted for those reasons. But why isn't there more uproar? Why is there sort of this acceptance, do you think, in many quarters that this is okay? I mean, this goes against all the ideals of free speech, et cetera, doesn't it? When you're equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism automatically.
Well, we're starting to see more of an uproar right now, I would say, because, certainly here in Canada, people take notions of free speech and freedom of expression very seriously. And people think that you should absolutely be able to criticize a government if you see that government is carrying out human rights abuses, like has been well documented in Israel. And, frankly, it's absolutely absurd what's being considered in the United States right now with this leaked State Department saying that organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch could be labeled as anti-Semitic. I think that this is something that people need to wake up to because it's very chilling, right? It has much deeper impacts, again, for these important democratic principles of being able to openly criticize and protest against governments, not because we're fueled by a sense of hatred or prejudice, right? Like the vast majority of people in a lot of parts of the world that are standing up for the Palestinian cause and for Palestinian human rights are not doing so because they're motivated by a sense of prejudice or hatred. They're doing so because they're motivated by a sense of love and solidarity. They see the crimes that are being committed daily against the Palestinian people, and this motivates people to speak out against the Israeli occupation and against Israeli human rights abuses. Just to mention one thing, we did a poll of Canadians recently by Ecos, which is a polling company. They've been operating for decades now. And so we polled Canadians on their views on anti-Semitism. And we found that 80% of Canadians do not believe that criticizing Israel for its alleged human rights abuses equates anti-Semitism. And so this is really interesting because it shows that, with what governments are trying to do right now, particularly the Canadian government where I am, which is in support of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, is very much out of step with the Canadian population. If you have 80% of Canadians saying we do not feel that criticizing the Israeli government is anti-Semitism, why are governments still being very insistent on using this extremely flawed definition of anti-Semitism?
Then if I may, say this, there is genuine anti-Semitism out there, isn't there, Aaron? So then what does this do in that regard? I mean, is this helping protect Jews around the world, or is this in some ways possibly even having the opposite effect where it's creating more polarization for the sake of that?
I would say it's definitely creating a lot of polarization, and that never helps. I mean, one thing it doesn't do is it doesn't help us identify where the vast majority of anti-Semitism, at least in North America, is coming from, right? And so if we take Donald Trump as an example, I mean, here is a president who in a recent presidential debate, not the one last night, but the one a few weeks before that, he refused to denounce the Proud Boys, who are a blatantly anti-Semitic group. A white supremacist and anti-Semitic organization like the Proud Boys might not actually be defined as anti-Semitic under the IHRA's definition, when clearly they're anti-Semitic because their founder, Gavin McInnes, is a raging anti-Semite. And so what we're seeing is that we have this trend where, of course, there is anti-Semitism out there. The vast majority of it is coming from the far right, is coming from groups that are not only anti-Semitic, but also at the same time will have Islamophobic or anti-Black racist views. And so what we at Independent Jewish Voices say is that, if we want to tackle anti-Semitism in an effective way, we need to approach it in a broader, more intersectional lens, meaning we have to have an understanding of anti-Semitism that also says it has to be tackled in parallel with Islamophobia, in parallel with anti-Black racism and all the other forms of discrimination out there. And I would not say that the IHRA is an effective tool in helping us to understand anti-Semitism. This coming Tuesday is going to be the 2-year anniversary, the 3-year anniversary of that horrible shooting at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, carried out again by a white supremacist. And so we have to be able to identify instances like that are clear instances of anti-Semitism. We have to be able to distinguish those from, let's say, when a campus organization gets set up and carries out a campaign to boycott Israel because of human rights abuses, which is far from anti-Semitism.
Indeed. This is a final word before I let you go then, Aaron, in just under a minute if you can. What does this do for the issue of Palestine, right? Because I get the feeling that the goal here in some regards, and maybe I'm overstating this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is to stifle as much discussion as possible about what's actually happening in the occupied territories, right? But that sort of reality can't remain hidden from the world, can it? I mean, shouldn't this actually be the opposite, where we should actually be encouraging more open discussions so that that issue is resolved?
Indeed, but what I'm really worried about, and what my organization is worried about, is that we're in a process of trying to limit that discussion right now. So this made national news here in Canada just a few weeks ago, but one of the most prominent universities here in Canada, the University of Toronto, there was a professor, Dr. Valentina Azarova, who was slated to be hired to lead the international human rights program there. And then this Dr. Azarova had done a lot of very critical research on Israel-Palestine, and her hire was actually blocked by a judge from the Canadian Tax Court who stepped in, and he's a donor to the University of Toronto, and he stepped in and he used his influence to block her hire simply because of the scholarship she does on Israeli human rights abuses. And so this has been a large media story here in Canada, and it's just one instance of this kind of chill effect that we've been seeing. We've documented dozens and dozens of cases in numerous countries, Germany, the United States, the UK, Canada, where the IHRA definition has been used to silence Palestine solidarity or Palestinian human rights movements. And so I think that this chill factor is something that should concern everyone. And of course, it could have a direct impact on the ground in Palestine, because what Palestinians are trying to do is build a global movement to get people to come to their defense in different parts of the world. And if we're not able to speak out, it makes things much more difficult there.
That was Aaron Lakoff speaking to us from Montreal this morning, speaking about this entire issue of, how there is now this equal sign, as I said in my introduction as well, between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. And it should never be seen as simple as that, because Israel, as I said, claims it is the biggest democracy, or the most important democracy, or the only democracy, in fact, I should say, in the Middle East. So why doesn't it act like a democracy? Why doesn't it open itself up to legitimate criticism, both of how it acts towards Palestinians and for a variety of other issues that we can probably list? Wills the stifling of any talk of criticism of Israel really succeed even in a world which is so interconnected online and otherwise? I mean, will this sort of movement by the U.S. State Department to label all these international human rights groups as anti-Semitic really work? I mean, can we limit free speech to this extent when it comes to the issue of Palestine? I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss a poll or a survey conducted by the Independent newspaper, speaking about Americans and their concern about riots and violence post-election, post-November 3rd, that is, because that's been an issue that's been spoken of for a while now. Even the likes of Donald Trump has said that he may not accept the election results if they don't go his way. He believes that the election may very well be rigged. Even on the Democrat side, I mean, Hillary Clinton did tell Biden not to concede if that theoretically does happen at some point in time, or that sort of scenario comes up too quickly at least, or if the race is very close. What does this mean then on the ground? Will there actually genuinely be violence? I mean, of course, it's very hard for anyone to say that with any sort of, confidence. But nevertheless, the fact that 72% of the Americans who were surveyed, that's 3/4 approximately of those who were surveyed, are concerned about this. And this is across the table, by the way. This is in both parties. That is of concern, isn't it? Because it seems like we're sort of walking into this really a dire situation, possibly, of course, after those elections in the U.S. Let's discuss that issue a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Rashawn Ray, who is a sociologist. He's a Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings Institution. He's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Joining us from Reading in England is Dr. Mark Shanahan, who is an associate professor and the head of Department for Politics and International Relations at the University of Reading. Mark and Rashawn, thank you both for your time today and for joining us here in Scope. Mark, let me start with you. What do you make of this poll by the Independent? Is this, as the Independent has said, a tinderbox, essentially, almost waiting to erupt?
Very good news story. And of course, the purpose of any newspaper putting out such a story is to get more readers, to get more traffic to their websites, to generate interest within this. Now, we're in a time of American politics that is probably more polarized than ever before. While the left has moved a little bit to the left, the right has moved considerably to the right. The Trump time in the White House has given encouragement and perhaps enablement to certain groups on the right who would quite happily come out and exercise their Second Amendment rights. But equally on the left, however large or small one believes Antifa is, and whether it is a movement at all or just a scare story, there will be some people who, if Trump wins, will not like that result. Whether they will actually get out on the street and whether the law enforcement organizations across the United States will allow them to be on the street is another matter entirely. But Trump loves disruption. And certainly from the right, if they see a means to disrupt this election, to challenge a close election, if it does turn out to be close, to get people onto the streets, then it may play in their favor. We are in potentially a dangerous time, but it may be that the news story is bigger than the reality.
If you agree with that, Rashawn, because even to me, it did seem like a bit fatalistic. But nevertheless, I mean, to me, what was shocking was that the number was this high, the percentage was this high. 72% is certainly not a small percentage of Americans who believe that there may very well be, or are concerned at the very least, about riots and violence after the election.
Well, I mean, I hope the professor is right. And again, thank you for having me on the show. I think what this is highlighting are a few things. First, that when it comes to what cable news shows and also what people see on social media is widespread violence this summer related to civil unrest. We also know that there were foiled kidnapping plots of the governors of Michigan and Virginia that, to the point that was just made, that I think coming out of the White House helped to embolden those particular activities. So as we head to the polls, it's not simply about whether or not Biden or Trump is going to win. It's also about the fact of whether or not the American public believes and has faith in the outcome. And that's something different. And distrusting government, distrusting the democratic political process is part of what can inflame violence. And now we also have to be realistic about where the violence might come from. We know when it comes to domestic terrorism that 75% of these domestic terrorist acts in the United States are committed by right-wing extremists, but 25% are committed by people on the left side. So as we think about this, we also have to disentangle the differences in what might happen between impacting people versus property. Oftentimes, left-wing extremists will oftentimes attack property, whereas right-wing extremists oftentimes attack people, and that leads to the violence. So as an American, I am worried about what might happen, but what I hope is that regardless of who loses, after we have evidence from mail-in ballots and absentee ballots, that the loser will concede, and that then will come out and say, look, we don't need violence, we need to come together. And I think that one candidate oftentimes is better positioned to do that than the other.
That's the real issue, isn't it, Mark? The polarization of all this, the divisiveness of all this, and this sort of puts into that survey and percentage points the reality of that sort of polarization on the ground across the U.S., right? And I mean, I would think that this is a monumental task, be it if the incumbent wins, Trump, or Biden comes into office. Both men would have a monumental task in trying to actually bring Americans together to A, accept their presidency, and B, to let them lead?
And normally, a president would spend his time, and of course it's always been a him so far, in their first term trying to unite the country, trying to bring the country together so that when they run for re-election, they have a far better chance of bringing in the independent voters, those who maybe won from the other side. Trump has done precisely the opposite. He has doubled down on his base. He has gone for a very narrow platform and a narrow group of voters to support him. And as Rashawn said so well, he has emboldened those on the fringes of the right. If he loses, and if it is a close loss, they are going to be the hardest ones for Biden to bring across. Now, Biden has presented himself much more as a unifying candidate, the candidate who is going to govern for all of America. But there are a lot to the right of him who will not support him. Now, the numbers who might come out and take to the streets are going to be very small. They are amplified and highlighted through media and through what we see in the media. The realities are the numbers are very small, but they are very dangerous. You have a country that has 300 million licensed weapons, never mind all of those that are held illegally. Those people who have guns tend to have guns in profusion. The tiny proportion of them who are willing to use guns under some kind of feeling that they have a right to support a wronged Trump will be a tiny, tiny number, but could make a huge and catastrophic impact on the country. What we really need is a very clear victory for one side or the other so that the whole election is not thrown into question. Now, it's Trump's side who has been attempting to denigrate the process that we have. And we know the American process of election largely works. There are some people who are excluded from it. There are some people who certainly won't be able to exercise their democratic right to vote, which they should have. But the vast majority, and 50 million have voted already, the vast majority of those people who have the opportunity to vote and choose to vote will do so peacefully. What we want is clarity in the results. It probably won't be on the night of November the 3rd, though.
Indeed. Rashawn, I wonder, when we're talking about this sort of divisiveness and polarization, right, right versus left in the U.S., in some ways, because, I remember the Obama presidency very well because I was a news anchor through that. And I remember that Obama had a very hard time, right, with the Republicans, attacking him and targeting him at every step along his path and during his tenures as president. So is this really that different? I mean, in some ways, yes, probably we can argue that Trump has sort of forwarded or fast-forwarded this process of polarization, but it begun way before Trump, didn't it?
I mean, most definitely. I mean, when we look at research over time, starting in the mid-90s, we started to see huge political polarization in the United States. Social media, of course, came much later and got blamed for something that was already occurring. Under the Obama administration, the first 2 years, the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. And he pushed the Affordable Care Act through. He pushed marriage equality through. There were things that went through, also ramped up the Department of Justice. Under President Obama, the most consent decrees were handed down, meaning when police departments around the country are investigated for wrongdoing, oftentimes racial discrimination. Under Trump, that happened in his first 2 years. And to Mark's point, part of what could really help the United States right now is not only if someone wins, and right now, polls are showing that Biden is going to win, but not only if Biden wins, but also if the Senate flips. And there's evidence to suggest that that might happen. So part of what that will mean is that Biden would be president, Democrats would control the House and the Senate. Not only would it be advances that would be made, such as the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that was passed by the House that would make people happy, particularly people who that police are engaging in police brutality and systemic racism, like my research shows, but also it's about the ability to try to unify the country and bring new people to Capitol Hill. And I think these particular changes will go very, very far. I think what people are worried about is not knowing who's going to win. If we flash back to 2000, what happened with Bush and Gore, this could be a repeat on steroids. And what people want to see is faith in the democratic process, that their vote was counted, and that we know who's going to be the president, and then that the other person concedes. And if that person is Trump, that is where I think the problem's going to come in.
Indeed. I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. At the end of the day, I mean, I would think at some levels, if we still have a concern after the election is over and the results are out, however long that may take, on the part of voters about whether or not the process was fair, clear, et cetera, their votes counted, that's sort of a distraction then, right, for the next president, whoever it may be, whether it be the incumbent or Biden, and that then makes their job that much harder because then they can't move on and lead the country and bring in the policies that they may have promised.
We go back to 2000 again, and that distraction was very clear at the beginning of the Bush presidency then. If Trump manages to win, his path to victory is a very, very narrow one. But if he squeaks through, whatever has happened won't be a distraction for him. He will feel vindicated. We will have 4 more years of a very disruptive presidency. It will damage America in world standing. But we've had 4 years of chaos. Be prepared for another 4 years. For Biden, it depends on whether it's a straight ticket victory or a split ticket victory. If Biden wins, but the Republicans hold on to the Senate, it will remain very, very messy. It will be hard for him to get any policy to stick and to land. Don't forget the Supreme Court is likely to be heavily conservative as well. If Judge Barrett is confirmed, as one would expect she would be, particularly if the Senate stays Republican. So best hope for liberals in America is a straight ticket victory. Is that likely to happen? There is a decent chance. Anything less than that, and it will be messy, and we will be having a lot of these discussions next year.
All right, well, we're all waiting for bated breath to see how those results play out, so once they do come out and whenever they do come out. But we appreciate both of our guests for their time today and for, of course, sharing their expertise. That was Rashawn speaking to us this morning from Washington, D.C., and Mark, who was speaking to us today from Reading in England. This issue about, Americans being concerned about riots and violence, again, is just indicative, as I put to our guests, about the divisiveness in American society, right? And as Rashawn pointed out, this isn't a new thing, but it's just become a lot more obvious because of social media and how now it's at least for those of us on the outside, how it's very much in our faces now when we see those debates and discussions online as well amongst Americans who are, again, at each other's throats, figuratively, of course, speaking about the politics in their country, the right versus left extremes in some regards, of course. Will all of this end and remain peaceful? Will Americans accept the results? These are all very open-ended questions at this point. And as I said, we're all looking for bated breath, with bated breath, that is, to see how those results play out on the ground in the United States. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.